Family first.
The steam from my coffee rose in a steady, silver ribbon, a perfect contrast to the jagged roar of Michael's engine tearing through the morning mist. He parked his sleek, black Mercedes across two flower beds Mary had spent all spring tending, a deliberate insult disguised as haste. I didn't move from my wicker chair on the porch. I simply watched him through the steam, measuring the distance between his arrogance and the reality he was about to hit. Michael stepped out, adjusting his designer blazer, looking at our home not as a sanctuary, but as an asset he was ready to liquidate. Harlan, our security guard, looked back at me with a question in his eyes, his hand hovering near his belt as Michael started shouting about legal access. "Let him through, Harlan," I said, my voice cutting through the noise without the need for volume. "He's come a long way to make a very big mistake." Michael marched up the steps, his face a mask of faux sympathy that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. He dropped a thick stack of legal documents onto the small table, rattling my saucer, but I didn't let my hand shake. "It's over, Robert," he said, checking his watch as if our lives were just a scheduled appointment he was running late for. "The house is in Jennifer's name now, and she signed the power of attorney over to me. You and Mary have until sunset to clear out." I leaned back, feeling the solid wood of the chair support me, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch until he began to fidget. He thinks that because my hair is gray and my movements are unhurried, I've lost the capacity to fight for what is mine. He has no idea that I spent all of yesterday with a very expensive lawyer and an old friend from the land registry office. Michael looked at his phone, a smug grin forming, completely unaware that the notification he was waiting for would be his undoing. He began to reach for the front door handle with a proprietary air, but he didn't realize that the locks were the only thing I hadn't changed yesterday. Michael paced my living room like a wolf in a tailored suit, his heels clicking against the hardwood with an irritating, rhythmic precision that signaled his impatience. He looked at the antique clock on the mantel, the one I've had to wind every morning since 1988, and sighed as if the passage of time itself were a personal affront to his busy schedule. My wrist buzzed. Mary had gifted me a smartwatch that insists on reminding me to stand up every hour, even when I'm already standing, a piece of technology that clearly lacks the wisdom to know when it's being redundant. I ignored the gadget, watching Michael run a finger over the bookshelf, checking for dust as if he were an appraiser instead of a guest. "This place smells like old memories and lost potential, Robert," he sneered, tossing aside a coaster Mary had knitted, as if its presence offended his modern sensibilities. I didn't flinch. I simply adjusted my glasses, which I'd accidentally sat on this morning, resulting in a slightly crooked view of his smug face that actually made him look quite ridiculous. He began detailing his plan to turn our orchard into a sustainable glass-walled office space, his voice dripping with the kind of corporate jargon that usually costs $80 an hour to endure. I found myself wondering if he'd ever actually used a shovel, or if his hands were kept soft by the sheer weight of other people's money. The betrayal didn't come from his words, though. It came from the realization that Jennifer had likely shared our private security codes with this man. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket, gesturing for me to sign a voluntary vacation notice, his confidence so thick it was almost suffocating. I leaned back, feeling the slight, familiar wobble in the chair leg I'd been meaning to fix for a decade, a reminder that even the strongest structures have their little quirks. Michael grew red in the face, demanding to know why I was smiling while he was busy dismantling my life. He didn't understand that a man who has survived 3 recessions and a roof collapse isn't easily rattled by a boy who panics when his Wi-Fi drops. I knew that in exactly 7 minutes, the first of my surprises would be walking through that door, and it wasn't the movers he was expecting. The smirk on his face widened as he pulled out his phone to show me a digital copy of the deed transfer, unaware that the confirm button he'd pressed earlier had sent a very different signal to the bank. Michael was already in the kitchen, swinging open the mahogany cabinets with a reckless disregard for the hinges, acting as if he were inspecting a foreclosed hotel room. He scoffed at my collection of vintage cast-iron pans, calling them unhealthy relics that belonged in a museum or a scrapyard. I tried to pull up my digital notes on the tablet Mary insists I use, but my stubborn thumb hit the wrong icon, and suddenly the house speakers were blasting a high-energy polka playlist I'd accidentally saved during a lapse in judgment last Christmas. I didn't scramble to turn it off. I simply stood there with a stone-cold face, letting the frantic accordion music fill the tension, pretending the soundtrack was a deliberate psychological tactic rather than a technical blunder. Michael's frustration boiled over as he snatched a crystal vase from the counter, a wedding gift from Mary's grandmother, and placed it firmly in a discard pile he was forming on the Persian rug. He began to speak to me with that slow, exaggerated enunciation people reserve for toddlers or the hearing impaired, explaining that clutter is the enemy of a modern lifestyle. I didn't interrupt his lecture, nor did I mention that the clutter he was tossing aside was the physical manifestation of 40 years of hard-earned stability. It is a peculiar sensation to be treated like a ghost in a house you built with your own calloused hands. But I've learned that being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage one can possess. He started labeling cardboard boxes with a thick permanent marker, the sharp scent of ink filling the air like a funeral shroud for our privacy. I watched his hands, noting the slight tremor in his grip. He wasn't as certain as he wanted me to believe, and his bravado was starting to crack under the weight of my silence. "You're just making this harder on Jennifer," he muttered, tossing a stack of our old vinyl records into a bin as if they were nothing more than plastic waste. I looked at the grooves of those records, thinking of the nights Mary and I had danced while the rest of the world slept, and felt a cold, sharp clarity settle deep in my chest. I reached into my pocket, feeling the weight of the silver flash drive that contained the true history of this property's title, a document Michael's experts had somehow overlooked in their greed. He didn't hear the heavy, synchronized rumble of the 3 black sedans pulling into the gate because he was too busy admiring his own reflection in the window. Michael was busy marking trash on my old leather-bound journals, his pen bleeding through pages of sketches I'd made of this valley before he was even a thought in his father's mind. I tried to adjust the smart thermostat Mary had insisted on installing, but my calloused fingers are better suited for wood-turning than touchscreens, and I accidentally activated the Arctic blast setting. He watched me struggle for a moment, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips, clearly assuming my fumbling was a symptom of a fading mind rather than a mismatch of man and machine. I let the sub-zero air begin to swirl around us, watching him shiver in his thin Italian suit, while I remained perfectly comfortable in my heavy, salt and pepper wool cardigan. "Getting a bit chilly, Michael. I suppose technology is only as smart as the person trying to outrun it," I remarked, letting the dry sarcasm hang in the freezing air. He snapped the journal shut and tossed it toward a pile of debris, a move that felt like a physical strike against 40 years of my private thoughts. My blood didn't boil. It turned to ice, the kind that stays solid under extreme pressure and cuts anything that tries to break it. He began lecturing me on diversified portfolios and how this land was dead weight, holding Jennifer back from her true social potential in the city. I reached into my pocket for a peppermint, but pulled out a loose screw from the cabinet hinge I'd been meaning to tighten. I simply pressed it back into the wood with a thumb strength that would have bruised a younger man's hand. He didn't notice the quiet power in the gesture, too focused on the sound of his own voice, which was starting to grate like a dull saw on a knotty piece of pine. Every time he spoke about clearing the board, I thought about the 3 hidden floor safes in this house he would never find without my permission or a jackhammer. He grabbed a framed photo of Mary at 22, his thumb smudging the glass, and asked if this lady would be joining me in the assisted living suite he'd graciously reserved. I didn't correct his insolence. I simply looked at him with the focused intensity of a hawk watching a mouse venture too far from its hole. "That lady," I said softly, "is the only reason you're still standing in this room instead of being escorted off this property in zip ties." He laughed, a hollow, arrogant sound that didn't account for the fact that the men from those black sedans were now walking up my porch with federal badges visible. He reached for his briefcase to finalize the eviction, but the lock clicked with a heavy, metallic finality that suggested he was no longer the one in charge of the combination. Michael stared at the men through the window, his bravado momentarily stalling like a cheap lawnmower hitting wet grass. I sat back and realized I'd forgotten to remove the stiff price tag from my new cardigan, the little plastic tail poking my neck. but I refused to reach back and fix it. Dignity requires a certain level of ignoring the small stings. "Who are they, Robert?" he asked, his voice losing its corporate sheen and cracking just a bit at the edges. I didn't answer immediately, preferring to watch him scramble to straighten his silk tie, which was now slightly askew from his frantic, agitated pacing. I've noticed that when men like Michael feel their power slipping, they revert to the frightened children they once were, just with more expensive haircuts. He started shuffling the papers on the table, trying to look official, but he accidentally knocked over my world's best grandpa mug, the one with the chipped handle I refused to throw away. It didn't break, just rolled across the floor with a hollow, taunting sound that filled the growing, suffocating silence. "They're old colleagues of mine," I finally said, the lie tasting like a fine, dry wine on my tongue. In truth, they were forensic auditors I'd hired to look into the generous gift Jennifer and Michael had used to purchase their latest downtown penthouse. I watched as the lead man, a fellow with a face like a bulldog and a suit that cost more than Michael's car, stopped at the threshold and nodded to me. Michael tried to block the doorway, puffing out his chest as if he were guarding a fortress instead of standing on a porch he didn't legally own. "This is a private residence," he stammered, his fingers fumbling with his phone as he tried to call his people. I found it amusing that he still thought his people were on his side, given that I'd spent most of yesterday making sure they were now my people. A man who hasn't learned that loyalty is built on trust and not just wire transfers is a man destined to stand alone when the storm hits. I stood up slowly, not because my knees were stiff, but because a slow rise commands a room far better than a frantic jump. Michael backed away, his heels catching on the rug he had so carelessly mocked just minutes before. He didn't see the woman stepping out of the second car, the one carrying a file that would turn his power of attorney into a primary piece of evidence. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of crushing weight you feel just before a mountain storm breaks the sky open. Michael was staring at the auditor's badge as if it were a poisonous snake, his face turning the color of skim milk, while his confidence evaporated into the Arctic blast still blowing from the vents. I decided it was the perfect time for a peppermint, though I spent a good 30 seconds wrestling with the childproof lid that Mary insists on using. Apparently, I'm old enough to own a corporation, but not to open a plastic jar without a tactical plan. I didn't let the frustration show. I simply applied a bit of leverage, the plastic snapping under my thumb with a satisfying crack that made Michael jump. He began to babble about misunderstandings and clerical errors, his hands fluttering like trapped birds against his expensive suit. I watched him, feeling the sharp, cold edge of a father's disappointment, a sensation far more painful than any physical ailment could ever be. To see the man your daughter chose for his ambition reveal himself as nothing more than a common thief is a bitter pill, but I've always had a strong stomach for the truth. The internal fracture I felt wasn't one of spirit, but of history, the realization that the legacy I built with sweat and grit was being treated like a carcass by my own blood. Jennifer thinks she's playing a high-stakes game of chess, but she doesn't realize her king has been in check since the moment Michael signed that fraudulent mortgage. I didn't raise her to be a predator, but if she wants to hunt in my woods, she should have checked who owned the traps first. The lead auditor pulled a document from his case, a forensic trail of every dollar Michael had borrowed from our family trust to fund his failing tech startup. Michael's eyes darted toward the door, his mind clearly calculating the distance to his car, but Harlan was already standing there, blocking the light like a stone wall. I stood my ground, my silence a wall he couldn't climb, my eyes never leaving his face as the reality of his situation finally began to sink in. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat when he saw the name on the second warrant, the one that wasn't about the house, but about the penthouse he thought was his secret. He lunged for the folder on the table, desperate to destroy the evidence, but he didn't realize that Mary had been standing in the shadows of the kitchen, recording every word he'd said. Michael's hand froze inches from the folder, his fingers trembling like a leaf in a gale as the auditors stepped closer. I didn't reach out to stop him. I didn't need to, because the weight of my gaze was more effective than a pair of handcuffs. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a lifetime of hard work, a silence that Michael will never understand because he's too busy chasing the noise of quick profit. I tried to maintain a look of profound, stoic disappointment, but my left eyebrow did that peculiar twitch it does when I've had one too many espressos, making me look like a slightly annoyed hawk rather than a vengeful patriarch. I quickly regained my composure, leaning back and letting the shadows of the room frame my stillness. "Sit down, Michael," I said, my voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards he thought he owned. He collapsed into the armchair, the one with the broken spring that makes a sound like a dying goose, a fitting soundtrack for the sudden collapse of his dignity. He looked at our home and saw an asset. He looked at our age and saw a weakness, failing to realize that experience is just another word for being better at the game. My rage wasn't the kind that burns out. It was the cold, sharp clarity of a man who has spent 40 years learning where the structural flaws in every building and every person are hidden. I looked past him toward the kitchen doorway, where Mary was finally stepping into the light, her face as calm and unforgiving as a winter morning. I wondered if Jennifer truly believed her mother spent all those hours on the computer just looking at knitting patterns and gardening forums. Michael's breathing was shallow, his eyes darting toward the exits, but there was nowhere left for a man of his small stature to hide. "I've said all I need to say to a boy who mistakes arrogance for power, and now it's time for him to deal with the person who actually keeps the books." I stood up, smoothing my cardigan over the price tag I still hadn't removed, and stepped aside to give my wife the floor. He reached for his phone one last time to call Jennifer, but he stopped when he heard the familiar chime of her ringtone coming from Mary's own pocket.
I stepped out of the kitchen shadows, the weight of Jennifer's phone in my hand feeling like a cold, vibrating stone. Michael's face drained of its remaining color when he heard the ringtone he'd programmed specifically for his wife, realizing she wasn't coming to save him. I caught Robert's eye and noticed the stiff price tag still fluttering on the back of his new cardigan. He looked like a majestic lion with a laundry receipt caught in his mane. I would fix it for him later, but in this moment, the small imperfection only underscored his quiet power, while Michael looked like a plastic mannequin melting under pressure. "You really should have paid more attention during those Sunday dinners, Michael," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. He had spent years watching me tend to my roses, likely thinking I was just a harmless woman with a watering can and a penchant for knitting. He never suspected that my knitting was often a cover for listening to the frantic, whispered phone calls he took in our hallway. "I've always been quite skilled at weeding, you have to get the roots, or the rot simply waits for the next rain to come back stronger." I placed Jennifer's phone on the table next to his cold coffee, the screen flashing with a dozen notifications from the forensic accountants I'd hired months ago. Michael tried to stand, but his legs seemed to have lost their corporate authority, leaving him slumped in the squeaky armchair Robert purposefully never oils. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I felt the sharp, clean clarity of a protector who has finally cornered the threat to her den. Jennifer is currently explaining her mistakes to the authorities, Michael, and she was never very good at keeping secrets when things got uncomfortable. I reached for my reading glasses, only to realize they were perched on top of my head the entire time I'd been looking for them, a small human moment in an otherwise perfect execution. I slid them down my nose, the lenses sharpening the image of his total ruin until it was as crisp as the morning air outside. I saw his eyes dart toward the back door, unaware that I had replaced his car keys with a set of old, rusted house keys from the garage. Michael was staring at Jennifer's phone as if it were a bomb about to detonate in the palm of his hand. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up my tablet, though I briefly struggled with the facial recognition because I still had a smudge of flour on my cheek from this morning's baking. I brushed it off with a sharp, brisk motion, feeling the soft dust fall onto my shoulder, a tiny reminder that while I am a strategist, I am also a woman who finds peace in her kitchen. "You thought I spent those long afternoons in the study playing solitaire, didn't you, Michael?" I asked, my voice dropping into a register of cold, quiet steel. In reality, I was tracing the labyrinth of shell companies you used to siphon off Jennifer's inheritance before you even had the chance to spend it. He looked down and finally noticed that in my rush to confront him, I hadn't changed out of my grandma slippers, one faded blue, one floral, a sight that should have been comical if the air weren't so thick with his impending ruin. He tried to let out a weak, mocking laugh at my footwear, but it caught in his throat like a dry bone when I swiped the screen to reveal his private offshore account balances. I have spent 40 years managing a household budget through every economic storm. A man who thinks he can hide $3 million from a woman who knows the price of milk in 4 different decades is a catastrophic fool. The auditors I brought in aren't just here for the deed to this house. They're here for the digital trail you left while you were busy disrupting the industry with my husband's retirement fund. I watched the realization wash over him like cold, gray water. He had married into this family for the wealth, but he had completely missed the tempered steel that forged it. We aren't just relics to be moved out of the way, Michael. We are the foundation, and you are just a temporary crack in the drywall. Robert leaned against the doorframe, his crooked glasses still giving him a look of eccentric menace, while he quietly checked his watch for the arrival of the sheriff. Michael's bravado was now a pile of wet ash, his fingers clawing at the edge of the table as if the wood itself could keep him from sinking. I felt a sharp pang of sadness for our daughter, wondering when her ambition became so distorted that she couldn't see the predator she had invited into our lives. I leaned in closer, the scent of lavender and a hint of antiseptic on my hands filling the space between us as I delivered the most damning fact of all. The mortgage you tried to seize doesn't exist anymore, Michael, because I paid it off in full 3 months ago with the money I made shorting your own company's stock. He gasped, his hand flying to his chest as if the air had been sucked out of the room by the sheer weight of his own stupidity. Michael's mouth hung open, a perfect, silent O of disbelief that reminded me of a landed fish gasping for air. I leaned over to show him the digital ledger on my tablet, but my fingers slipped and I accidentally swiped to a blurry photo of the burnt sourdough loaf I'd made last Tuesday. I didn't blink, simply swiped back as if the charred bread were a deliberate visual metaphor for his career. He tried to scramble for a defense, but his words were tangled in the wreckage of an ego that was never built to withstand a storm this cold. I've spent decades being the woman who brings the tea and smiles at the stories, while secretly memorizing every discrepancy in the family accounts. It is a peculiar kind of invisibility that comes with being a grandmother, and I use every second of it to build a fortress around our future. Michael looked at Robert, seeking a man-to-man reprieve, but Robert was too busy trying to fix his crooked glasses with a piece of Scotch tape that kept sticking to his eyebrow. Despite the tape and the domestic struggle, the look my husband gave him was enough to freeze the blood in a younger man's veins. I reached out and took Michael's designer phone from the table, feeling the expensive glass under my thumb, a toy for a boy who thought he could outrun the people who taught him how to walk. You see, Michael, when you've lived through enough seasons, you learn to spot the frost before it even hits the ground, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room. He realized then that I hadn't just protected the house, I had dismantled the very ground he was standing on, cent by cent. The lead auditor stepped forward, placing a heavy, bureaucratic hand on Michael's shoulder, a gesture that signaled the end of his time as a guest in our home. I felt a sharp, crystalline anger, not the kind that screams, but the kind that ensures the job is finished with absolute, surgical precision. We aren't the frail leaves he expected to sweep away. We are the ancient roots that break the concrete when it tries to contain us. He looked toward the window, hoping for a miracle, but he only saw the second wave of black vehicles pulling into the driveway, blocked perfectly by Robert's old, immovable tractor. Michael's gaze shifted from the auditors to the window, watching Robert's rusted 1974 John Deere sitting squarely in the center of the driveway, like a sleeping iron beast. Robert had claimed it stalled right there this morning while he was moving some mulch, but I saw the wink he gave me over his porridge. He'd intentionally parked that relic to ensure no one left this property without our permission. I watched Michael's hands ball into fists, the knuckles white against his tan skin, a physical manifestation of a man who has run out of exits and lies. This is harassment. He spat, his voice reaching a shrill pitch that made the crystals in the chandelier chime softly, a sound far more elegant than his tantrum. I reached for a tissue to wipe a small smudge of tractor grease off Robert's cheek, but I accidentally grabbed a stray bit of blue yarn from my pocket instead, dabbing his face with a fuzzy ball of wool. Robert didn't move an inch, accepting the grooming with a stoic dignity that made the blue fuzz on his cheek look like a badge of honor rather than a mistake. I turned my attention back to Michael, noting how his expensive shoes were now covered in the dust of a floor he thought he'd already conquered. Harassment is a strong word for a man who signed my name to a loan using a forged power of attorney, Michael, I said, the words falling like heavy stones into a deep well. The confrontation wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the sanctity of the threshold he had dared to cross with malice in his heart. He tried to snatch back his briefcase, but the lead auditor simply placed a folder of sworn affidavits on top of it, the sheer weight of the truth pinning his ambitions to the table. I've spent 40 years building a life where every brick has a story, and I'll be damned if I let a boy who can't even change a tire dismantle my legacy. Michael's eyes were wild now, darting toward the phone, then the door, then back to the men who were slowly, methodically, packing up his life into evidence bags. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction, not because he was failing, but because we were still standing, as unyielding as the hills surrounding this lake. The silence that followed was thick with the scent of old wood and the ozone of an approaching storm, a pressure that Michael was clearly not built to survive. I looked him dead in the eye, letting him see the reflection of his own insignificance in my gaze, and saw the very moment his spirit finally snapped. He lunged toward the sideboard, his hand reaching for the ornate silver key bowl, thinking he could still find a way to the secondary safe in the basement. Michael's hand dove into the silver key bowl like a desperate scavenger, but all he found was a collection of spare buttons from Robert's old work shirts and a rusted hex key for a desk we'd sold in the 90s. I watched him stir the metal scraps, his eyes frantic and wild, while Robert accidentally leaned back against the wall panel, triggering the hidden party mode lighting we'd installed for our anniversary last year. The living room was suddenly bathed in rotating neon pink and electric blue, a surreal, pulsing disco for the death of a corporate reputation. Robert didn't scramble or look embarrassed. He simply stood in the strobe light with his arms crossed, looking like a seasoned captain who had seen too many storms to be bothered by a few flashing lights. The absurdity of the neon glow while a man faced potential life-altering charges didn't escape me, but it only served to highlight how small Michael's drama really was in the grand scheme of a life built on truth. "There is no secondary safe, Michael," I said, my voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the rotating light fixtures with the precision of a diamond saw. He turned toward me, his face twisted in a snarl of desperation, finally dropping the mask of the polite, successful son-in-law we'd tried so hard to welcome into our hearts. It is a bitter realization when you see that the person your daughter loves has been treating your entire existence as a mere technicality on a legal balance sheet. I felt the sharp, cold weight of a mother's duty, knowing that protecting Jennifer from her own poor choices meant letting her current world crumble today. Robert reached out and finally found the override switch to kill the lights, plunging the room back into the gray, honest light of a rainy morning. "You should have spent less time looking for safes and more time looking at the people who actually built this house," Robert remarked, his dry wit a final, cold splash of water on Michael's burning ambition. Michael lunged for the basement door anyway, a futile attempt to hide or perhaps find some mythical leverage he still believed was hidden in the foundation. I didn't move to stop him, because I knew the basement stairs were freshly waxed and the heavy steel door at the bottom had been locked by the auditors before he even arrived. The sound of a frantic, metallic rattling echoed up from the dark, a clumsy and hollow ending for a man who thought he was a master of grand moves. I stood at the top of the dark stairwell, listening to his breathing hitch in the shadows, waiting for the moment he realized the only way out was back through the room he had just tried to steal. Michael emerged from the basement stairwell, his breathing ragged and his expensive silk tie hanging like a noose around his neck. He looked at the room, our sanctuary, and finally saw it not as a collection of square footage, but as a fortress he was never invited to command. Robert was by the kitchen island, engaged in a losing battle with the voice-activated smart kettle Mary's sister gave us. It kept insisting on reading him the morning news in French instead of boiling water. "I don't want to know about the Paris weather, you insufferable teapot," Robert grumbled, poking the touchscreen with a thumb that could still crack a walnut. I watched the scene with a cold, quiet detachment, realizing that even in the midst of a family betrayal, life's small, absurd frustrations continue unabated. Michael slumped against the doorframe, his gaze falling on the digital photo frame on the sideboard, which chose that exact moment to cycle to a picture of him and Jennifer at their wedding. I didn't turn it away this time. I wanted him to see the faces of the people he had tried to trade for a higher credit limit. The documents you signed this morning weren't the final transfer papers, Michael. They were a full confession of the embezzlement from the trust, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden, sharp silence. I felt a fleeting shadow of the woman I used to be, the one who believed in second chances, but she had been replaced by someone far more practical and dangerous. He looked at me then, truly seeing me for the first time, and I saw the moment he realized the sweet old lady had been the one tightening the net while he was busy admiring the knots. My hands, steady and calloused from years of gardening and holding this family together, didn't tremble as I handed the lead auditor the final piece of the puzzle. Robert finally gave up on the kettle, the device emitting a defeated beep that sounded remarkably like Michael's own fading bravado. We are not the ghosts of a bygone era, waiting to be ushered into the shadows. We are the keepers of the flame, and we know exactly who is worthy of the warmth. He moved toward the front door, his steps heavy and hollow, unaware that the final person waiting for him on the porch was the one he feared most of all. Michael pulled open the heavy front door, only to find Jennifer standing on the porch, flanked by two uniformed officers and the district attorney. Her eyes weren't filled with the tears he had expected to exploit. They were as sharp and unforgiving as the winter ice on the lake. "I made a choice, Michael," she said, her voice a perfect, chilling echo of the strength I had tried to instill in her since she was a child, "and it wasn't you." Robert shuffled past them, muttering about how the door hinge was squeaking again, and he actually managed to get his wool sleeve caught on the latch, momentarily trapping him in the middle of the most dramatic moment of the decade. He didn't lose his cool. He just patiently unhooked himself, gave Michael a look of profound, silent pity, and walked toward his workbench as if the arrest were merely a minor background noise. I stood behind my daughter, my hand resting firmly on her shoulder, feeling the tremor in her spirit settle into the same tempered steel that has kept Robert and me upright for 40 years. Michael was led down the stairs, his expensive shoes finally slipping on the wet gravel, a pathetic, undignified tumble that marked the end of his reign as the family's supposed savior. We watched the taillights fade into the morning mist, the silence of the valley returning to claim its rightful place once more. Robert returned from the kitchen with two mismatched mugs, having finally defeated the smart kettle, though he'd somehow managed to brew a cup of herbal tea that smelled suspiciously like my dried lavender potpourri. He handed me the mug with a crooked smile, his taped glasses sitting askew on his nose, yet he had never looked more like the man who once conquered mountains just to prove he could. We didn't need to shout our victory or gloat over the ruins of a broken man. The house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the intruders were finally purged. Our age isn't a countdown to the end, but a fortress built from the strength required to keep what we have painstakingly created. I took a slow sip of the strange, floral tea and looked out over the land that was still, and would always be, our home. We didn't break under the weight of their greed or their assumptions. We simply outlasted them, standing our ground until the world remembered exactly who we are.